All right, students, welcome to our discussion on the 1950s. We are going to talk about this particular decade. It's going to be a quick homework assignment for you so that we don't have to do this part in class. So without further ado, let's get going so I don't waste any more of your evening. So quick thing, GI Bill is one of the things we're going to be discussing today. We're also going to talk about the rise of suburbia, car culture, consumerism, the Brown v. Board Supreme Court ruling, and the general atmosphere of conformity that was prevalent throughout the 50s. So let's start with the GI Bill. So when World War II ended, America found itself in a difficult position. It had a large army, and the wisdom of the day was that you only kept a large standing army during a time of actual war or conflict. When that was over, you reduced the size of your army. We don't do that anymore, but at the time, that was the conventional wisdom. So to accommodate this new reality, the United States, it was well known, was going to be discharging a large number of soldiers. But there weren't a lot of jobs for those young men to come back to, not a lot of entry-level jobs for these gentlemen to return to. And many feared that, because remember, a lot of those jobs in the war, one, a lot of companies were cutting back production because they'd been making wartime goods. And now that was no longer something that was required. And two, a lot of those positions had already been filled by women and people of color. So for a lot of young men who had served in the armed forces, they were coming home and there wasn't necessarily a job waiting for them. And many feared that, an army that had been trained to fight in Europe and in Asia would not just willingly sit down and accept unemployment as people had in the Depression. So to prevent any and all of these issues, the U.S. military decided that it would be in their best interest to simply, they decided it would be in their best interest, sorry about that, be in their best interest the government was going to issue what was called the GI Bill. And what it did is it gave either, if you were a soldier and you'd served honorably in the war, you could either get a loan for a small business or you could get your college tuition paid. So for a lot of soldiers, especially a lot of white soldiers, what this meant was that they didn't return to the entry-level factory jobs they'd left behind. They came back, they got either a college degree or a small business loan and went on either to become the small business owners or the office managers and desk workers of the 1950s. If you were not white, this wasn't necessarily open to you, especially if you were African American. If you were Asian American, it was kind of like some people got it, some didn't. But otherwise, no. So as I was saying, African American servicemen were denied these opportunities. So if you were an African American and you served in the United States military, you didn't get to get a small business loan or your tuition paid. Instead, you were just told, okay, great, you're dishonorably discharged. You can go back home. And what was waiting for you at home usually was the same level of poverty you had experienced prior to enlisting. So that was the story with the G. Moving on to suburbs. We got to talk about what a suburb is. Now, a suburb is a small town that borders a major city and is economically tied to that city. So, for example, Westchester County is a suburb of New York City. Colony is a suburb of Albany. You get the idea? These are towns or collections of towns, in the case of Westchester, that are bordering a major city and are economically tied to that city. This is separate from urban or just full-on city environment. So, something like that. Harlem is a neighborhood within the urban center of New York City. Delaware Avenue, that whole Delaware Avenue stretch of community is a area within the city of Albany. You get the idea? Exurban are towns like where I grew up, like New Paltz, Highland, places like that. They are outside of major cities and are not economically tied to that city whatsoever. Rural communities are smaller farming or mining communities, which are usually sparsely populated and are located much farther from urban centers. So the secret to suburban growth in the 50s is the rise of Levittown. This is a community of mass-produced homes in Nassau County, Long Island. These homes were developed rapidly and cheaply, and thus these simple homes gave veterans of the Second World War a chance at home ownership for the first time. Now, Levittown started off as a rent with option to buy community, where you would rent the house for a couple of years, and if you liked it, then the rent you paid would be applied towards your down payment on the property. If not, you could either continue to rent or you could leave. But soon it became so popular to buy these houses that by the time they were building the second Levittown, not only was it firmly just a community of privately mortgaged homes, but a home could be viewed, mortgaged, and sold in minutes. Man, I wish my closing process was that quick. But anyway, beyond the troubles of buying a house in the old days, Levittown was commercially quite successful. And so soon other suburbs followed. These planned grid pattern suburbs soon followed. Now, most of these suburbanites, these dwellers of the suburbs, they lived in these communities of pre-planned houses and worked in nearby cities. So suburbs didn't produce their own economy like exurbs do. They are dependent on the economy of a nearby city. So in the case of the original Levittown or Levittowns, that city was New York City. However, the path to suburbia was not open to all. Levittown was strictly, as they put it, reserved for, quote, members of the Caucasian race, so white people. Now, other suburbs followed suit. And at first, this may seem odd. After all, why would a business want to restrict the number of people that can buy their product? Well, the answer came down to public prejudices and people's willingness to pay more. See, you could ask a higher price if you could guarantee that the community was segregated, which tells you a lot about people in this time period. They're willing to pay more, often thousands of dollars more, as long as they're guaranteed they don't have to live next to a person of color. It's not exactly a flattering picture of Levittown, but that was the reality. This led to a phenomenon known as white flight. And this is where this is a mass exodus, a mass exit of white families from the inner city to the suburbs. So if you look at the large ethnic neighborhoods, Little Italy, Little Budapest, these various ethnic neighborhoods of New York City, most of the white ethnic neighborhoods start to shrink. And that's because the people that live there are leaving the city and moving out to the suburbs. So what we get is a de jure segregation, a law-based segregation in the suburbs, where the suburbs had rules. And now the way they enforced this was the initial sales associates were basically told as company policy only to sell to white people. And when you bought the house, you signed what was sometimes called a covenant agreement. And what this basically was it was an agreement in which you promised that when you bought the house, that you in turn would only sell it or give it away as an inheritance to another white person. So that was the agreement. And these would remain legally binding agreements until they would later be struck down by federal law. So this legal-based segregation in the suburbs led to a de facto segregation, just a fact of life kind of segregation in the city. Increasingly, the inner city neighborhoods became almost exclusively Black and Latino, whereas the suburbs became increasingly white. Now, with this rise in this rise of suburbanites living outside the city, this led to an increase in commuting. However, in order to accommodate a lot of this, many African-American neighborhoods were bulldozed in order to free up room to create the infrastructure for easy suburban commutes. For example, large sections like FDR Drive in New York City were basically bulldozed parts of Harlem to create that drive. FDR Drive and its connecting the Harlem Hellfighter Drive were created to make commuting easier, which is something that comes as a shock to many, especially if you've ever commuted on that road. Now, car culture in the 1950s. See, when America went to war, winter of 1941, by 1942, they'd suspended all automobile production. You couldn't make new cars. It was all aircraft aircraft was what these car manufacturers were building. So alongside home ownership, car ownership became a staple of middle-class America. To prove you were middle class, you had a house and you had a car. And because it had been almost a decade by the time, since cars had been sold, because it wasn't until like 46 or 47 really that cars started to come back on the market. So it's been half a decade. And this half a decade since cars were even available to be bought. When you consider that before that you'd had the Depression, so a lot of people couldn't afford a new car anyhow. For a lot of these Americans, it was kind of this jovial experience, and the cars reflected this. They were bright colored in pastels with chrome accents, and large rear fins, and they were large vehicles. If you ever see an old 57 Chevy or Cadillac DeVille from those days, they were massive. Like the lower picture you're seeing of the gentleman sitting in the Cadillac, that Cadillac that he's sitting in is a two-door convertible coupe. That two-door coupe is as long as many modern SUVs. Now, driving became a major pursuit in the 1950s. Much of this was practical. If you lived in the suburbs, you often commuted to a major city for work. So driving into work every day was just a part of life. Road trips, though, soon became a popular family vacation, and the whole economy really had this major development. Major state routes were dotted with motels designed to provide lodging for campers, people to stop along the way as they went road tripping. Campgrounds also sprung up. For those who didn't want the motel, they could go camping. Now, to provide nourishment to these people along the roads, there was soon a major boom in fast food locations, providing cheap, high-calorie food designed to be appealing to a family on the move. Now, this was a pastime that crossed racial and ethnic lines. But for Black motorists, this became a particular problem because in many parts of the country, establishments were not open to them. So this led to the rise of what were called green books, and they were a list of, they were a directory. They contained lists of motels, restaurants, and other attractions that were open to Black motorists. Now, much of this road tripping was facilitated by the Interstate Highways program. Now, the Interstate Highways is a very uniquely American innovation. You see, the interstate had originally begun as a military project designed by President Eisenhower, who had previously served as a general in the Second World War. Eisenhower had wanted the interstate for two reasons. One, he'd observed in the past watching Allied bombing strategies that in the event of a war, first thing most enemies did was bomb out your train tracks. So if you're trying to move soldiers or equipment around, it helped to have large multi-lane roads that were easy to move large quantities of people or supplies along. The second thing was that if you ever look at the pattern of interstate highways, where they're near airports, you'll notice something very weird. If you ever look at this on a map, the straightaways on the interstate run parallel to straightaway runways on major airports nearby, and that's not an accident. The idea was that in the event that there was a war and American military airstrips were bombed out, you could theoretically land and take off aircraft from the straightaway portions of the interstate. So while the interstate was designed primarily for military purposes, it soon became a major hit with the American public because it allowed you to easily travel across states at high speeds without the constant distraction of slowing down and stopping and turning as you pass through numerous small towns. Now, one of the things we talk about in the 1950s is the growth of consumerism, or keeping up with the Joneses. Families were preoccupied with owning the latest and most up-to-date furniture, appliances, cars, houses, etc. And people ask why? Why did we become so materialistic again in the 50s? And there's a few answers, and historians really aren't sure what to make of it. Some argue it's because it was this reaction to the end of wartime austerity. For 4 long years, Americans have been asked to make do with less, to buy less, to consume less. And now with the war over, many reacted by buying and spending in excess. So just as how you had this boom of materialism in the 20s following World War I, you had a boom of materialism in the 50s following World War II. Others argue it was prosperity after years of economic depression. Young people who'd grown up in the Depression having nothing or next to nothing suddenly found themselves in a position having money. And as a result, there was this obsession with, well, I want to have the latest and greatest. I never could have nice things before. Now I want all the nice things. Some argue that as America settled into the Cold War, there was an increasing sense of conflict between capitalism and communism, with America choosing to fully take the side of free market and free capitalism. That meant kind of rejoicing in the prosperity of American industry, and this idea, look, consuming is good, became kind of a mantra. And others argue that blame actually rests on the federal government. After the war, there was a concerted effort by the federal government to convince women who had entered wartime industries to leave those industries and become homemakers again. And the government released a wide variety of films trying to convince women that what they really wanted to do was leave the factory, get married, have kids, yada, yada. Well, to do that, they often showcase these gorgeous houses and kitchens and areas with all the latest and greatest technology. And so many argue it worked, but it also gave many young couples, the impression that this is what they're supposed to have, that this is the base standard. You got to have all these things. Who knows? Probably some combination of all of these points. So what were these new consumer products? Television sets, electric can openers, washers and dryers, which have been invented earlier, gained major improvements, and refrigerators became standard. So while the 50s is primarily regarded as an era of consumer excess, where white America reveled in its newfound prosperity, there were stirrings of change. One, in Levittown, there was a movement made to racially integrate the place, although this failed. Of more importance, though, is Brown versus Board, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But first, we have to discuss the tragedy of young Emmett Till. Now, young Mr. Till was lynched August 28th, 1955. Emmett Till was a young gentleman. He was a young boy. He was in his early teens, and he was down in the South visiting relatives, and he went into a general store, and there was an accusation that he had spoken inappropriately to a white woman in the store. Years later, the woman has confessed that she made it up. He never said anything inappropriate to her, but she told her husband that. This woman's husband and at least one other conspirator, it may have been up to 14, we're not really sure on the details. They drove over to the house where Emmett Till was staying, took him out at gunpoint, dragged him to another location where they savagely beat him to death and dumped his body in a nearby river. Now, the gentlemen, and I use that term loosely, who did this, were put on trial, but none of them were convicted. The jury decided to acquit them, and it was not for a reason of not believing they did it. The lawyer who defended these individuals, who defended the lynching individuals, outright came up to the jury and said, "What would any of y'all daddies think, or your granddaddies think, if you convicted these men of killing a word I'm not allowed to say?" But you get the idea. It worked. The jury full on exonerated them. Years later, some of the people involved would suffer future legal consequences, but not at this point. Now, Emmett Till's mom, who was a native of North up in Chicago, she had his body flown back home where it was displayed in an open casket funeral. See, traditionally, when people die in horrific ways, the convention is that you have what's called a closed casket funeral, meaning that the coffin is closed, the lid is closed at the funeral, and people don't see the body of the deceased, they just see the coffin. However, she wanted the world to know exactly what had been done to her son. And so she had an open casket funeral so people could see the real horrors of what lynching had done to her boy. It stirred a lot of calling for national change. On a more positive note for the Black community is the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case. So the plaintiff in the case is a gentleman by the name of Oliver Brown. Now, this case began as a class action suit initiated by Mr. Brown and others on behalf of the African-American residents of Topeka, Kansas. See, Mr. Brown's daughter lived closest to a particular elementary school, but that school was a segregated white school. And so the Board of Education wanted to put her on a bus and take her to a school that was much farther away, but was segregated only for African Americans. He and parents like him sued, arguing that his child should be allowed to go to the school that was closest to where she lived. The court case was decided on May 17th, 1954. In that case, Brown versus Board, the court ruled that separate was inherently unequal, that just to separate children in an educational setting was to create or to suggest that they were not equal. This overturned the earlier Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, which had argued that you were allowed to segregate people racially in a public setting as long as you produced equal accommodations for both races. That was no more. So racial segregation, at least in schools, was struck down by this ruling. So again, as I said, education separate was declared inherently unequal. This created the doctrine, which is still implied today, that every child is entitled to a free and public education in the least restrictive environment possible. Now, this is important to understand here. The court didn't have to take the case. Because they'd already ruled on segregation, the court could have simply invoked the principle of stare decisis, or it is decided, which is what the court typically does when it doesn't want to rule on something it's already ruled on. The fact that the court agreed to take the case meant that the justices seated there wanted to examine the issue of racial segregation. And it was a unanimous ruling by the court. Now, Thurgood Marshall was the attorney. He was part of the legal team for Mr. Brown. And he would later go on to become the first African-American Supreme Court justice in this nation's history. However, just because the court had signed off on school integration didn't mean it happened overnight. Southern states often moved slowly to actually integrate these schools. There's a lot of administrative minutia that has to be handled whenever you integrate schools, right? You've got to now determine what building is being used for what, come up with new bus routes, move kids around, move schedules around, move paperwork around. It's a lot of bureaucratic fluff. Well, many of them moved deliberately slow on the process. And many outright balked at it. They said, nope, we're not doing it. In 1957, when Little Rock Central High School was being integrated, the governor of the state called in the National Guard to bar African-American students from entering the school. So imagine you show up to enter your high school and there's a set of soldiers standing outside with guns telling you to go home. Now, President Dwight Eisenhower didn't stand for this. He sent elements of the 101st Airborne Division to force the National Guard to stand down. Now, while Little Rock, Arkansas became a scene of this massive showdown, other states were a little more crafty. They just simply closed their public schools entirely. They shut down the public schools in their state and instead would issue to white families, basically they would give them vouchers for what they paid in taxes so they could go and use that money to enroll their kids in a private segregated school. Now, something we have to understand about the 1950s is that there was a tremendous effort on the idea of conformity, of homogeneity, of everyone being the same. And families struggled to appear as being the typical American family. And any deviation in ideology could lead to reprisals. This also meant strict gender roles for men and women. Men were expected to go to work, watch sports, drink beer. Women were expected to cook, clean, and have babies. And any deviation in that was not tolerated. And certainly there was no accommodation for anyone in the LGBTQ plus community, which we are going to talk about in a little bit. I'm going to have you look at the film Boys Beware in a little bit. Well, actually, you're going to watch it on your own, separate from this. So that brings us to the end of our, not quite. We got one more discussion. Music. See, prior to the 50s, in 1948, blues singers had added electric amplifiers to their guitars, creating a sound known as electric blues. In the 1950s, this evolved into a new style of music known as rock and roll. The music was based on jazz and blues, and it was popular with young people. Now, by modern standards, rock and roll music was tame, but some of the dancing of their musicians, like Elvis Presley with his hip gyrations, ignited a small moral panic. this is where we are going to end for today. So I hope you enjoyed this brief tour through the nifty 50s. I'll see you all later when we actually dive into the 1960s and the civil rights movement.